I am Lauren with Me Too Many Voices, and we are lucky to have Kim here with Invisible Combat. So I will pass the floor over to her.
Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here. Lauren is amazing. Her platform is amazing. I think she does amazing work, and I'm so glad and so grateful to have connected with her. Um, so this is a really simple PowerPoint. I literally just threw it together really quick, just so you have something to look at while I talk. Um, so we're going to talk a little bit about military sexual trauma. Of course, I am a survivor of military sexual trauma, but I'm also an advocate as well. And so I kind of am going to be talking a little bit about my journey and also kind of about, the inner healing process after a sexual trauma. So this is kind of relatable to both military sexual trauma survivors and also probably regular, civilians who have also experienced sexual trauma. Of course, there's going to be a trigger warning because I am sharing a little bit about my story. And so if anybody feels unsafe or needs to take a break or anything like that, just let me know. And I have no problem in stopping or taking a break. And I don't want anyone to feel triggered. So just know this is a safe space. Any questions you have, just, interrupt me, let me know. I don't mind. This is kind of an interactive discussion, So I just want to say, trauma can definitely interrupt our narratives, our regularly scheduled narratives. It's a stumbling block. It's an intrusion, something that was never intended to be there, right? But, what if I told you that it is possible for your trauma to actually be the beginning of a new narrative, sometimes even a stronger narrative than it was previously? You'd probably ask me, like, how could that be, right? How can pain be a powerful thing? Because it really hurts, right? It does. I know this, and I know you know this. Today, I'm going to be discussing something that I'm super passionate about, but also that I'm personally invested in, inner healing work after a military sexual trauma. It's a taboo subject. People don't like talking about it, especially in the military and the veteran communities. It doesn't get discussed enough, I don't feel like. But it's something that unfortunately many of us as women and men, right, in the veteran communities have experienced. And oftentimes it leaves lifelong repercussions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own personal story today, and I'm also going to discuss how I was able to heal after trauma. We're also going to be doing an activity that is a visible and tangible representation of the work that I did to heal myself. And I hope that, this process is empowering to you and can help you actively engage in your own healing journey, but also feel empowered to support others. Because I know a lot of you are probably advocates that are in this platform as well. So this is my little brag screen. I just did a workshop on I Am Remarkable. And one of the questions was, I am remarkable because, and we had to kind of brag about ourselves for a moment, right? I am remarkable because of overcome trauma or whatever it is that you feel like you're really empowered, right, for yourself. And so it's kind of weird to talk about yourself in that way and be like, this is a brag screen. But I'm like, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to drop a brag screen into the next presentation that I do, because it's so important to be able to take that power and be like, yes, I have accomplished a lot, right? And be able to really internalize that. So this is my brag screen. So here's a picture of me on my graduation day with my two little brothers. Thank you. I graduated from the University of Southern California with my master's in social work. And believe it or not, these two boys right here, this is the first day I've ever met them, because I'm also a former foster youth and I was adopted. And so that was a really special day for me because I got to meet them. And I also, basically it was a triumph over trauma for me, because the educational journey was not an easy one for me. But yeah, so I was able to graduate, pretty exciting. And now I'm currently working on my PhD in psychology, with an emphasis on traumatic brain injuries and veteran incarceration, something really personal to me. And as I talk about my journey, you'll kind of understand a little bit more about why this research is so important to me. But at least that's what I'm hoping to form, so that I can really start my advocacy in that vein. Because I currently volunteer in the Veterans Treatment Courts here locally for me. And so incarcerated veterans is a really special topic for me. And too often, they've had experienced traumatic brain injuries or post-traumatic stress disorder, and it has gone untreated and undiagnosed for far too long, right? And especially when we talk about our female veterans, because the research is really non-existent when it comes to female non-combat even related TBIs, traumatic brain injuries, and PTSD. Because oftentimes traumatic brain injuries can also occur outside of combat when we're talking about domestic violence, when we're talking about sexual trauma. People don't realize that that also plagues the veteran community outside of combat, right? And then exasperated with combat, right? So currently I work as a diversity and inclusion trainer and program developer. And I work to ensure marginalized communities and members of our society are not discriminated against based on, community projects and things like that. So, of course, my passion is in the veteran community. That's where my passion is. That's where I want to work. So I don't normally do that in my normal day, day-to-day job, but I do that on the side with the Veterans Treatment Court. I run a platform called Invisible Combat, which that's where Me Too Many Voices and me connected. So part of my story, and you can go to the next slide. So that's my brag screen. That's about me. That's where I'm headed in my advocacy and all those things, right? But what happened to me, right? Because that screen that you saw previously, that was not always me. And I had a really rough journey just to get to that spot of happiness and smiling that you see. So what happened, right? I joined the military in 2005. And of course, being that I was formerly foster youth and I was adopted, I was really looking for family. I was really looking for connection, for purpose. And I really found that in the Army. And I think a lot of people who are in the veteran community, are in the military community, can understand just how connected we can be in the service. It's like basically finding a new family, right, outside of your biological family. And because I didn't have strong connections with my biological family, I really clung to those Army values and those unit cohesion that we speak about a lot in the veteran community. So what we know about basic training is that it is an incredibly effective, it's incredibly effective in stripping you down of your previous identities, right, and building you back up into strong military core values, right, and beliefs, duty, honor, loyalty, selfless service. All of those core values are now like your identity, right? And anyone that you were previous to that usually is kind of null and void or minimized, right? Mental and physical toughness is also something that's part of our military creeds. And it's also something that's very internalized. And I think that's why some of the discussion around mental health is so taboo in that population or that community, is because we are ingrained to be resilient, right? Our focus is on resilience and combat and those types of things, and not really on the individual and what the individual needs, right? So, of course, I came into the service with, I wouldn't say pre-existing trauma, but so to speak, sort of. I mean, I did have a little bit of attachment issues. Most foster youth and most children who are adopted can probably relate to that. I was also, I didn't mention this prior to, but I was also a product of sexual assault. So that's the reason why I went into the foster system in the first place. So this whole sexual trauma is like a generational thing for me, and when we talk about generational trauma, that can have long-lasting implications. Even if you didn't know it, I had no idea that had happened to me or that happened to my mother until I got a little older and I was able to officially meet her. But even before that, I knew, trauma like stays in your body and it can like manifest, and we call it epigenetics, right? Genetically, it can manifest in our, generations, so to speak. And I felt it. I knew there was something off with my origin story. And then I think that's why I like clung so hard to the military unit cohesion and family bonding, was because I was looking for family, right? Connection. I was looking to fill a void, right? So the most important thing about this story is the concept of unit cohesion, or like I like to refer to it as a type of trauma bonding, right? We know about this in the domestic violence cultures, that people can really bond in traumatic situations, and then they look for people who also have traumatic experiences to really bond with. Because it's a closeness that can really only be described as like, I would die for you, right? Or you would lay your life down for me. And that's love, right? That's when we think about love, we think about laying our life down for somebody else, right, that we care about. And in the military, that's really a predominant, idea, right, for all of us. And so, of course, that's the beauty of unit cohesion in times of war or conflict, right? We can really cling to each other and save each other in those situations. What we know about unit cohesion is that it has a mitigating effect on combat-related stressors. And it can be incredibly beneficial to our soldiers to have a strong unit support, right, and unit cohesion. So it's beneficial in that way. But, what happens if that unit cohesion is creating a hostile environment for somebody who's in that situation, right? And what happens when the hostility comes from within the unit and you're basically systematically oppressed and not able to protect yourself because you no longer have ownership of yourself or your life. You are the property of the military, right? And you're subject to command direction. So if you experience a traumatic situation that happens within your unit, oftentimes you're still stuck in that hostile environment and you can't get out because you can't really just get up and move. You can't really go seek support sometimes. It's very minimal. So in 2006, not even a year after I got to my first duty station, I was sexually assaulted by a leader in a leadership role that I trusted to have my back, right? The assault resulted in a traumatic brain injury for myself, and of course this is the trigger warning because some of this can be a little heavy when discussing this, but it's really relevant to, the overall discussion, right? I had a traumatic brain injury because I was knocked unconscious, and unfortunately that injury went misdiagnosed and untreated for a long, long time, for many, many years. Due to the shame and the silence, right, surrounding that self-advocacy. I didn't tell anybody at first when it first happened. And so I was trying really hard to be silent about it because we know in military culture, when you speak up about things like this, it's often looked at as a betrayal to the unit because we're talking about that strong unit cohesion. And so even though it's not said, like they're not out there telling you don't speak up, and sometimes they are. I've had plenty of soldiers and veterans have come to me and said that they actually told them to be quiet, right? But oftentimes it's an unsaid rule. You just don't speak about it because if you do, you're going to be not part of the team, right? Or you're going to be a betrayal of the unit cohesion, right? That we were so connected, right? And oftentimes you see this in like family sexual abuse cases, right? When a survivor is afraid to speak out because of the patriarch style in the home, right? And because that person maybe could be a leader in the home, right? It's kind of similar in that way, that sometimes, like for me, it was a leader in a leadership position, right? And that happens often, where rank and achievements can be looked at and minimize the actual trauma that victim is surviving through. And so another thing that happens in military life is that when a soldier becomes pregnant, most of the time the command knows right away, right? Everybody finds out usually. HIPAA protections are not usually something that happens in the military because of that combat readiness, right? You have to be ready at all times, and so oftentimes you can't keep mental health or medical support confidential. Oftentimes the command knows about it right away, and so that's what happened to me. I found out I was pregnant after this assault. So about 4 weeks after the incident had occurred, I found out that I was expecting a child. And so when I found out about that, I had no choice. I had to come forward. I had to say something about what had happened to me. It was like, it was a secret, right? A shameful secret that I had to keep. And all of a sudden now everybody knew. And I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. And so like many others who have come forward due to military sexual trauma, of course I was retaliated against naturally, right? That's what happens in a lot of times in military culture, by my own battle buddies, right? By my own people who I figured would always have my back. It was like living in a hostile territory, right? Without being in physical combat. because at the time I was stationed in a hospital. I was a combat medic. So of course my main duties were to save other soldiers' lives that were severely wounded in battle. They would come directly from the field right to us, and we would be the stabilizing unit overseas. So we stabilized them, then we sent them on their way to, back to the States or back, overseas if they needed to go back to combat. So that's what my mission was, right? To save lives. But at that time, I felt like nobody cared about mine. It was like my life was non-existent, didn't matter. Because the mission came first, always, first and foremost, right? So for me, it really created an internal hostility, right? I was in a work environment that was full of hostility. I mean, I couldn't even go into the cafeteria without people getting up and walking away. I would walk down the hallway and people would turn around and walk away. They would see me coming and they'd be like, oh, we can't talk to her. It was really bad. It was like that for I want to say a couple months, right, after the incident. And so I started avoiding the shame and guilt. I started using all kinds of maladaptive coping strategies that I could come across, right? Because at that time, it was like I couldn't escape myself. I was stuck inside of myself. And I had this huge hostility building up, right? And I think a lot of other survivors probably go through something similar, even outside of military sexual trauma, where they have this shame and guilt, right? That's suffocating them and they just can't get out of it, So I was in a really dark space. This is while I was in active duty service. And so I started trying to avoid it by any means necessary, numbing, using alcohol, using, risky behaviors, right? And that really spiraled out of control. At the time when I was in service, I actually did have a suicide attempt. And at the time, even then, mental health was such a taboo topic that I was told basically I was misdiagnosed again. I was told that I had postpartum depression, right? And I didn't have, PTSD, which is very likely. I mean, that's what it was. I was experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. I was experiencing nightmares, flashbacks, but it was manifesting in poor behavior, right? So leadership looked at me like I was, this poor soldier, not adapting to military life, right? When in reality, it was because of the trauma that happened, literally right when I got there, and it happens to so many of us. And so after I left service, I literally spiraled out of control. I found myself homeless. I found myself in and out of incarceration because I was using all these maladaptive coping strategies. And once I left service, it really manifested in outside of alcohol. I started going into other substances and things like that, just because I just could not stand being with myself, right? I couldn't stand just living in that shame and guilt. And so I was basically just trying to survive by any means necessary. And I think with a lot of survivors, we tend to self-blame, right, when it comes to our behaviors. And really, they're just survival behaviors. That's all they are, and maybe they're not the most healthy, not the most adaptive, but oftentimes we don't know how to create those positive adaptive coping strategies. So we're going to self-medicate by any means necessary, right? And that's what I did. And the pain was really becoming overwhelming. So told you that pain is a powerful thing. I mean, you probably would agree. It really is. But how can it be painful, right? I mean, powerful, because it hurts a lot, right? And sometimes it hurts so much, like I said, we completely act like it doesn't exist, or we just find ways to survive. And there was a pivotal moment for me one day after I thought I hit rock bottom. And I say thought because I literally hit rock bottom 5 different times. And I didn't think I could get any lower, but I kept hitting rock bottom. And, I lost my children temporarily for a little while. I got arrested, right? I got incarcerated. I had a stroke, literally had a stroke. And you would think that would be my rock bottom, but it wasn't, And I got arrested again, right? And I went to jail again. And again. And it's depressing, right? Seems depressing. But it's not, because, I ended up taking this story and completely transforming it. But it was in a moment that I had nothing, right, to lose except my life, of course. And at that time, I didn't care. I would, what you would call, probably be parasuicidal, right? Self-harming behaviors. I wasn't actively engaging in suicidal behaviors, but at that point in my life, I'm like, whatever, who cares, right? If I die, I die. That's how I was looking at life at that time. And the only thing that I could do was own my pain, like, because I was incarcerated, right? A funny thing happens when you're forced to take a back seat to your life and like stare at blank concrete walls, right? You're forced to take a hard look at your inner self and all the pain, all the stuff that was layering on top of me, right? And some of those moments of deeply rooted pain came back like a flash flood. I'm not gonna lie, it wasn't easy. It was very difficult because at that time I wasn't able to utilize my coping strategies that I was using to survive by any means necessary, because I'd been repressing all of those memories and all that trauma. So then I realized that these memories and pain, they only had power over my story if I let them have power. And that was like a mind-blowing experience for me because it meant that I had the power to reframe my narrative and I could consciously decide what came next, right? If I was going to end up in that cycle of incarceration, if I was going to end up in that cycle of self-harm, right? And maybe I wouldn't have a stroke the next time, maybe I would die, right? So don't get me wrong, just because I made that conscious decision, miracles didn't happen right then. I made some poor survival choices after that. But what did happen was that I started in motion a chain of events and choices in my life where eventually that pain did not control my life anymore. It didn't define my existence. Instead, it became a foundation, that rock bottom foundation that I built a new story on, right? That surviving by any means necessary was no longer my narrative. And I chose, right, and make the conscious decision to live. So pain can totally be a powerful thing. It can really limit your progression if you choose to let it, or it can be a motivating factor into a new narrative. And so you can change the slide. This one's going to be interesting because I'm in my closet, so to speak. So this is going to be interesting activity, but I think it's really insightful. So I want to lead us in an activity that really represents an integral part of my own healing journey. It's a visible and tangible representation of the work that I did to kind of get out of that dark space. I call it inner light work because it's really rediscovering your inner light. And so let me see if I can get this. So I have this lamp here, and it's going to represent well. You'll see it. I don't know if you can even see it. So, you can kind of see where I'm going with this. So there's this lamp right here, right? And it has this light, super bright, right? And I call this light bulb, it's like a really bright light. It's an LED light, so it's super bright. But I call it the inner light, right? This light is going to represent our inner core being, our centered self, so to speak, right? Everything that makes us us, our spiritual self, everything that was us before the painful interruption to our trauma, to our narrative. Outside of systemic racism, because I haven't even touched on that, right? Or outside of marginalized, oppressive identities, right? We haven't even talked about that either. And that's super powerful when it comes to doing inner healing work. And this is you before the sexual assault, right? And I have these scarves here. I don't know if you can see them. Normally I would do this like in a in-person setting where we could all kind of contribute to it, but it's kind of difficult now that we're all stuck at home, right? So these scarves here are going to represent the collective experiences of our trauma, right? Individually. So each one of these scarves is going to represent an individual trauma that had interrupted our narrative. Be it intergenerational trauma, right? I kind of shared that a little bit about myself. Attachment disorders, right? Some of the unintentional impact or consequences that happen from trauma, right? It's going to represent our systemic racism or marginalized oppression experiences. They're going to represent military sexual trauma or sexual trauma in general. The military culture, right? So I'm going to start layering these over the top of the light. And it's going to really affect the lighting in my office. But so as I put these on top of the light, you'll notice a couple of things, right? That it's starting to get darker in here. And the light is starting to kind of go away, right? And some of these are kind of sheer, but I have some darker ones. So eventually when we start compounding all of these different traumas on top of this inner light, right? Ableism, if you're disabled, right? Relational issues, right? That can result from these compounding traumas that we have. Really, any representation of painful interruptions to our narrative that compounds and exasperates our invisible wounds, right? These scarves here are kind of heavy. You can't really see this, but like the lampshade is kind of like drooping a little bit because these are starting to get heavy, right? And we carry these burdens with us, these traumatic experiences with us, just dimming our inner light. We carry them with us every day, right, into the rest of our narratives. And we can start feeling disconnected from that light, right? And eventually, if we were to layer these on and continue to layer them, the light would be gone. We wouldn't be able to see it, right? And it's quiet, disconnected, you know, space, right? We feel disconnected from our light. I was literally stuck in this space for so many years, just stagnant in my personal growth, stuck in a grieving period that I just could not get out of. I couldn't figure out how to get over that grief, right? But like, what was I grieving, right? I didn't actually lose anybody, right? But during this time, I learned 4 things that were imperative to my healing journey, right? I learned, number 1, that rock bottom is a really crappy place. You don't want to be there, right? And I hit it not once, but I hit it several times over the course of my journey. Just being incarcerated, right? Like I said, in a place where you're forced to reflect on yourself and your inner self because you literally have nothing else to do, right, during that time. That was an incredibly insightful space. Number 2, it's okay to grieve the loss of who we were before the trauma. It's totally healthy, right? And the loss of who we were supposed to be, or who you thought you were supposed to be before the trauma occurred. In fact, you need to do that. That's healthy, right? Don't avoid this step. Don't minimize it. Don't overlook it because it's really important work. You need to validate. Number 3, validate your experiences. This is super powerful because we need to identify them and educate ourselves on what that looks like and looks like for us, right? And we cannot be afraid of honoring that as part of our journey, right? Because too often with sexual abuse or sexual trauma or any type of marginalization, right, we have been invalidated, we've been gaslighted, we've been unbelieved for so long, and that really hurts. But we can take back that power. We can, by standing in our truth and living authentically. And like, believe me, literally, you will find your tribe when you start honoring that strength of yours, because we're here and we totally get it. I get it, right? I did a lot of this work on my own without any support at all because I didn't have that supportive network, right? So that's not what I suggest for anybody. Literally find your tribe, but you'll find it when you start living authentically with yourself. And this is a really important one. Number 4, start taking action, right? Make a conscious decision to actively engage in the healing journey. And this is where all the healing work begins, right? But it doesn't happen overnight. I took baby steps, and that kept me alive. I made a decision that I deserved to not just survive, but, to actually live and to find myself again. So in this process, you start peeling back each layer of the scarf. That was a lot. It came out all at once, right? But you get the gist of it, right? So you start peeling back these layers of these scarves, right? And you grieve with them, you validate them, with yourself. Sometimes you need to validate it with somebody else. But you really cannot stay there. You have to actively work through each layer and grieve this and put it aside, right? And with that shame and guilt, that was really never ours anyway to begin with. So we never really should have internalized that, which is really difficult to say because, so often we do keep that in our space, right? So after all of that, it really was not the rock bottom that made me want to heal. It was a moment that I realized that I was disconnected from myself, that I was disconnected from my inner light. And that's when I decided that my trauma was no longer going to decide my narrative for me, that I was going to take back ownership of it. So the next step for me was to reconnect to who I was before the trauma. What brought me joy? Has anything changed, right? Really checking in with yourself. I was a scholar. I loved academics before all of this happened. Learning was something that I really enjoyed. So I really took baby steps to reconnect to that part of me. I enrolled in school. I completed my bachelor's, I finished my master's, and now I'm still on that process, right, in my PhD program. But the important part is that I'm no longer too afraid to engage in these discussions, right? These are important dialogues to have. I'm no longer afraid to be vulnerable in my story, in my truth. And I really took time to honor and grieve, right? All of that. So that was all the work that I had done collectively. And I really just want to leave you with these thoughts. We have to make the conscious choice to take our power back. And that really means deciding that you're worth it and that you deserve it. Because if you don't feel like you're worth it and you don't feel like you deserve it, all the work in the world is not really going to help you reconnect to your light, right? So if not now, when, right? If not you, who? I had to hit rock bottom several times in order for me to figure out that I actually deserved to heal. I kept telling myself I couldn't do it. I kept telling myself this wasn't my purpose. I didn't know I really kept asking myself, what is wrong with me, right? Why can't I get my life together? I was in a state of avoidance. I didn't want to look at my trauma. I didn't want to look at my mess, right? I didn't want to start peeling back these scarves. And I started getting stagnant and comfortable in that darkness. But that's not for us, right? We don't deserve that. We totally deserve to be happy. And we totally deserve to find ourselves again. And it's definitely possible. Trauma impacts us, but it definitely does not define us. And I know logically we know that, but we can recover, we can heal, we can grow, we can take back our narratives, and we can really reclaim our light. So yeah, so that's what I wanted to leave you all with. I hope that was really empowering. I mean, I felt it. I'm like, oh, I feel this. This is really empowering for me.
Not to speak for everybody, but I found that incredibly empowering, and hearing your story, your resilience, your power, you taking your power back. Incredibly moving, incredibly empowering, inspiring. I'm really moved. I feel like I'm very much caught in my own thoughts. So apologies. It just really, really affected me. Thank you for being so vulnerable. Vulnerability is strength, and it's a gift to all of us. As cheesy as that sounds, it really, truly is.
I appreciate it. And I don't want anyone to feel like this is a trigger moment. I know my story is kind of heavy at times. And a lot of our stories are really heavy at times as well. But, just know that there are places that you can reach out to. I didn't actually put them on here, but, I'm a volunteer crisis interventionist. So I work for the crisis text line. I don't do it as much as I should because I'm so busy. But if you ever have a crisis and you really need support, like in the moment, if you text 741, you can be connected to a crisis interventionist that can help you at that moment, at least to bring you from like a hot moment to like a cool, calm, and at least to like start planning, right? If you needed to be connected to a therapist, or if you need to be connected to somebody who's going to be more consistent with you, then that's a good place to start if you ever feel like you need it. This is my contact information. So if anybody wants to reach out to me or contact me, I am on Facebook and Instagram. I don't offer services. I'm not in the mental health field, even though I have my degree in mental health. I don't work as a clinician. And most of the reasons why I don't work as a clinician is because I'm still actively working on this journey. And I don't feel like it's good for me, right? I know my limitations, right? And countertransference and all those things. When we're advocates, we understand that. And I know that I'm not in the space to really be of good service, of ethical service to people, because I'm still working on that inner healing. But I'm on the road, and we all are on the road, and hopefully you will make that decision to like start your healing process today, because you're never going to get back this moment, right? And tomorrow is a completely brand new day with new opportunities and potential, right?
Thank you so much. I feel so pensive right now. I'm trying to draw myself out of it a little bit to go into moderator mode, but that really speaks to the power of everything you said, and the exercise with the lamp. I know you and I had talked previously about you doing it, but
Yeah.
nothing, it still didn't prepare me for the effect that it had on me. What a really powerful image.
I appreciate you allowing me to share in this space. I'm really grateful for that too, as well. Because this is also healing for me, being able to share, my journey and my truth.
I'm glad. It's quite the journey. You never know what people have been through, how they have endured, and all they continue to, and the story that we carry.
Exactly. Yes.
I thought I would see if anybody had any questions that they wanted to type into the chat.
I really hope that it was empowering. And, because when we talk about, and I laugh a lot, I think it's a nervous habit that I have, that I laugh a lot. But I do tend to laugh about experiences in my story, but that's like the best way to cope with such a heavy story is, humor and being able to look at it like take yourself out of the situation, right? And that's a lot of work that I had to do with grounding and things like that too, and being able to not be in the moment, in that fear or in that sad space, right? That depressing space. But really, this kind of work is a lifelong journey. It's not something that just magically disappears, like your trauma just goes away just because you've done this work. But it really is helpful to reconnect with yourself, because you're the biggest advocate that you can have for yourself, and you're going to know your body the best. You're going to know what works for it and what doesn't work for it. And so I think that's just the most important takeaway, is that you just really need to reconnect to yourself, spiritually, holistically, however that looks for you, because if you don't, then you can stay in that dark space for a really long time, and sometimes people never get out of it, and that's just a tragedy, because people, they deserve to be happy, right? Everybody deserves that. Ironically, I actually worked in the TBI clinic overseas, and I was experiencing a TBI, which is really ironic, because I was like one of the individuals who was like collectively gathering the data for this TBI research that they were doing, but I wasn't included in that, mainly because I wasn't combat. So because those questions weren't asked to me, I kind of fell between the cracks a little bit. Because oftentimes the research and the data and even the advice or the information that they give is going to be really combat specific or related to soldiers that have experienced TBIs in the combat field, and not necessarily like domestic violence or military sexual trauma. But hopefully with discussions like these and with my PhD, when I start doing my research, I really want to focus on that so that we can bring that to the narratives, because it's really important to discuss, especially when it comes to female veterans, because we just don't have enough research, right? There's a lot of advocates. There's tons of advocates out there that speak on these issues, but not a lot of research that's being done to kind of, be the forefront, right, in these discussions. But so I'm not sure how much information they have really that's pertaining to, like, it depends on what you're looking for. I know that a lot of it's combat specific support.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your time, your stories, your gifts, your resilience. Thank you for sharing your light with us. We're very grateful. And I'm really glad that we've gotten to know each other.
Yes, I'm really glad that we connected too. Yes, we're definitely gonna stay in touch.
For sure. You're stuck with me now.
Good. I'm glad.
Well, everyone, thank you for joining us and being part of the community. I'll see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.